Chapter 1. The Wagon Train to Fort Bellows. It was a bright afternoon in May, the sinking sun casting golden light on the wide prairie. The Yellowstone River, winding like a great yellow serpent, rolled through the landscape. This river sprang forth at the base of the Rocky Mountains and flowed towards the east, ultimately emptying into the Missouri River. The sunlight shone down upon the whitewashed walls of Fort Bellows, a frontier post located at the confluence of the Yellowstone and the Powder Rivers. The fort was there to guard the wagon trail heading towards Montana. Now, with the progression of modernity, the fort is gone, but at that time, travelers viewed it as the last resting place before continuing on their journey towards the gold-streaked rocks of Montana. Leaving Fort Bellows, the wagon train traveled around 200 miles along the Yellowstone before turning northward towards the Rocky Mountains along the Southern Trail. The northern route was by the bank of the Missouri. Fort Bellows was protected by a single company of the United States troops, roughly 100 men. Trading houses were set up nearby to provide necessary supplies like powder, ball, blankets, and other things needed on a 300-mile journey through the wilderness. After leaving Fort Bellows, the trail went through the fertile valley of the Yellowstone, filled with rich grasses. The river had abundant fish, and the little clumps of timbers on its fringe were sometimes filled with game. This terrain just needed the helping hand of civilization to bloom like a fruitful garden. The wagon trail through this lovely country was not without its dangers. The fierce Tamlicky tribe of Indians lived near Fort Bellows, their hunting grounds stretching from the Bighorn River to the Little Missouri. The Tamlicky were deadly enemies of the Sioux, who sometimes wandered far enough to reach the Powder River. These Sioux were brutal raiders from the Missouri. Following the wagon trail along the Yellowstone River, one would eventually pass where the Bighorn River emptied, swollen always by the melting snows of the Rocky Mountains, into its healthier cousin. This signaled entering the Crow Nation's dominion, the Indian monarchs of the Northwest. This tribe's warriors wore grizzly bear claws and teeth as necklaces, symbols of their strength and dominance. Of all the tribes inhabiting the lands from the Gulf of California all the way to the Columbia and Missouri rivers, the Crow Nation was deemed the best fighters. They were well known for fighting the powerful Blackfeet and holding their own against them. Gold diggers in southern Montana were rightly terrified by the tribe's war cry. After crossing the junction of the Bighorn and Yellowstone rivers, the old mountain men and prairie guides know all too well the dangers that lie in wait. It is a treacherous place, and even the largest wagon trains can lose people and livestock on their journey through the valley and on towards Montana. But our story begins at Fort Bellows, where a wagon train has just arrived and is resting before its treacherous journey through the wilderness. The fort and its surroundings are a bustling hub of activity, with soldiers chatting and eagerly reading newspapers brought by the emigrants. The train is made up of around 20 wagons, carrying about 60 people, men, women, and children alike. The party boasts 23 men, as well as 2 guides who are well versed in Indian warfare and have a reputation as some of the best Indian fighters in the Upper Missouri. Their names are Abraham Colt and Slim Wilson, but they are more commonly known as Albert and Dave. Albert, the elder of the two, is a man of around 40 years old and stands nearly 6 feet tall. Despite weighing only 150 pounds, he is all muscle, bone, and sinew, with no extraneous flesh. He is a skilled prize fighter and has been accustomed to the wildlife and dangers of the prairie since childhood. His father had been a guide before him, and when he was fatally shot in a Crow attack on a wagon train, Albert swore an oath of vengeance against every redskin of the Crow Nation. This reputation as a fierce fighter and his legendary victories over the Crow make him a hero among the frontiermen. Standing alongside his fellow guide, Slim Wilson, Albert surveys the scene with a listless air, leaning on his rifle. The 2 guides are ready to take on anything that might come their way, and their presence alone is enough to make any attackers think twice. They are prepared for the dangers that lie ahead, and they know that the journey will be perilous, but they are up for the challenge and eager to keep their party safe. Albert was far from resembling the legendary Indian fighters. He lacked any trace of the outlaw. His skin was a deep, warm brown from the sun and wind of the plains. His grey eyes were large, and his chin was smooth and hairless. His rugged features bore the marks of a hard life, with numerous wrinkles gathered around his eyes and mouth. He wore the attire of a Native American, including a hunting shirt made of deerskin with porcupine quill trimming, tight leggings of the same material, and beaded moccasins. On his head rested a cap made from a coyote's pelt, with the tail hanging at the rear. His curly black locks framed his face in tight ringlets. Albert stood gracefully with his rifle propped casually at his side. Any person coming from behind might easily mistake him for a chief of the tribe. His companion was a young man known as Slim Wilson. His past was a mystery. Nearly 2 decades before our time, a group of American soldiers stumbled on a camp of raiding Blackfeet Indians near the Missouri Riverhead. Thrust into battle, the outnumbered Indians fought fiercely, but were nearly obliterated. Following the encounter, the soldiers discovered an infant boy, wrapped up snugly within a blanket not far from the Indian camp. From his complexion and the outline of his features, the troops calculated that the baby was a half-breed, potentially sired by a white wife of one of the Indian braves. Kidnapping white girls in frontier attacks to become their wives was customary among the tribes. The reason for the child's presence during the raid, in contrast to tradition, puzzled the experienced Indian fighter who acted as a guide to the soldiers. He closely examined the camp and eventually found the tracks of a woman. It was apparent that a squaw accompanied the group, possibly one of the white wives that great chiefs occasionally had. However, why the chief would bring her along on a raid remained a mystery. The soldiers brought the young child back with them to their post. The baby appeared to be around 1 year old. The captain, in charge of the troops, acted as a sponsor for the child who was bizarrely discovered in the desert. He decided to name the child Slim Wilson. As time progressed, the infant grew rapidly. Years passed, and the child grew into a man who became a prairie guide. He was known on the Upper Missouri as one of the most reliable marksmen and excellent guides in the Upper Valley. He was a handsome young man standing at about 5 feet 9 inches tall. He had a well-proportioned and robust physique. His countenance exuded a natural dignity that was reminiscent of the Native Americans. His large, jet-black eyes were full of fire, and his nose was long and straight. His square and well-formed chin had firm-set lips that exhibited resolution and strength of purpose. His face was bronzed, and his high cheekbones, coupled with his jet-black hair that slightly curled at the ends, worn long and flowing down over his shoulders, revealed his Indian heritage. He wore rough attire, consisting of a red shirt that was carelessly thrown open at the neck, exposing his finely formed throat. He wore a pair of butternut homespun pantaloons that were cut open at the side and fitted into the leg Indian style, and a pair of moccasins that an old Indian fighter would have immediately recognized as being of Sioux manufacture due to their peculiar trimming. He wore a belt made of untanned deerskin that encircled his waist, supporting a broad-bladed hunting knife and a serviceable-looking revolver. This was Dave Wilson in a nutshell. 3 years before our story's commencement, Wilson encountered the Crow Killer in Montana. A peculiar friendship blossomed between the two men, and they never separated after that point. Any wagon train that hired the Crow Killer and young Dave Wilson as their guide across the upper plains was considered fortunate. "Hey, Crow Killer," Dave asked, "does that guy near the riverbank belong to our train?" Crow Killer inquired, "War?" as he turned his eyes in the intended direction. Dave pointed towards a man standing near the river with his back towards them, wrapped in a dirty red blanket entirely covering him. On his head he wore a common black felt hat, and long black locks fell over his shoulders, forming a remarkable contrast to the red blanket. Albert took a good long look at the motionless figure. "Well, do you know him?" asked Dave. "Nary time," replied Albert. "He looks like an Indian, derned if he don't. He's a powerful big feller, I should judge." Just then, the stranger turned around, revealing a face a few shades darker than Dave's, but not dark enough to declare the owner as an Indian, or if he was one, much lighter in colour than his race. The stranger had an odd face, high cheekbones, dark skin, flashing black eyes, and no signs of a beard, all of which would indicate him to be an Indian. Yet his long black hair curled slightly at the ends, which was much finer than the usual coarse locks of a redskin. As the stranger faced them, his eyes wandering over the talking crowd, Albert had a full view of his face and started in astonishment. "What's the matter?" questioned Dave. "That man's face," replied Albert, still staring intently at the stranger. "Well, what of it?" "Why, he's the perfect image of you." Dave's eyes widened in surprise as he turned to look at the stranger. As Albert had mentioned earlier, the man shared an uncanny resemblance to Dave, save for his darker complexion. Both men had long black hair that curled at the ends and flashed with the same intense black eyes. The stranger had almost identical features and was of a similar size to Dave. "He looks like me," Dave said, sounding puzzled. "He looks like you. You two could be cut from the same cloth," Crowkiller exclaimed, clearly taken aback by the likeness before him. "It's certainly strange," Dave mused. "Strange is an understatement," Albert added bluntly. However, there was something even more peculiar about the situation, which a keen observer would have noticed. Both Dave and the stranger shared the same overall expression and features as Albert, the Crowkiller. Despite their differing eye colours, the three men could have easily been mistaken for father and sons. "He looks like an Indian, but he's too light-skinned," Dave remarked, trying to make sense of the situation. "Yes," replied the Crowkiller, his sharp gaze fixed on the unfamiliar figure. "He ain't one of our party, I know. I reckon he's a stranger here too, 'cause he don't seem to recognise none of the folk round these parts. He don't quite look like an Indian, but he might be one with some white blood in him. That'd explain his lighter skin tone." "I'll go over and see who he is," Dave declared. "Go for it, young buck," encouraged the Crowkiller. "That's a great idea." At that moment, a corporal from the nearby post approached the two guides. "Who's that feller over yonder? Any ideas?" the guide asked. The corporal peered at the still form, wrapped in a flashy blanket. "I don't know him. Think he's a stranger to our ranch," he answered. "You ain't seen him before, then?" Dave inquired. "I don't believe so. Might be one of them Tamlicky Indians come round to snag some whiskey or the like," the corporal suggested. "He ain't no Tamlicky," Albert spoke up after studying the figure some more. With that, Dave strode off toward the stranger, eager to discover who he was and what brought him to these parts. Chapter 2. The Fighting Man. The stranger seemed unconcerned with his surroundings, even appearing half asleep. Yet despite his languid appearance, his eyes darted back and forth, taking in every detail. He noticed the two guides chatting amongst themselves, casting furtive glances in his direction. Knowing they were discussing him, the stranger turned his gaze toward the river, ready to escape at a moment's notice. Eventually, his attention returned to the bustling crowd near the fort. That's when Dave walked up to him. "How are you, stranger?" Dave queried. "I am well," the unknown replied in a deep, guttural voice, instantly identifying him as a red-skinned Indian. "Is the chief a Tamlicky?" Dave probed. "No," replied the laconic stranger. "Sioux?" "Yes." "What tribe?" "Yankton," the stranger revealed, true to Indian custom in speaking sparingly. "Why has the chief come to Fort Bellows so far from his home?" Dave pressed. "Arcano is a Sioux chief who fought Tamlicky braves on the Powder River. In the darkness he lost his brothers. He journeyed north to the wigwams of the blue-coated braves. He is at peace with his white brothers, but he is hungry and thirsty. Arcano is a great chief of the Yanktons." The savage spoke his story with a stolid expression, his quick, intense gaze transforming into a dull gleam. "Did my brother come on foot?" Dave inquired. "The chief is not a mud turtle," the savage retorted. "He does not crawl when he can fly like the eagle. My white brother will look." The chief indicated a small, open space between the fort and the river, where a stunning white horse with black patches on its flanks was tethered to a stake. The guide stood in awe as he gazed upon the stunning milk-white steed of the tribe's chief. He had seen many a magnificent horse in his day, but none could compare to this one. "Your brother's horse is handsome," commented Dave, the guide. "The chief is a great brave among his warriors. He rides on the wind. The Mustang never lived that could overtake the white vulture," responded the Indian with savage pride, referring to his horse by its name. "Is that your horse?" inquired Dave, curious about the unique name. "The chief has said," replied the Indian with unwavering dignity. "If my brother is hungry, come to the fort and eat," offered Dave. "My brother is good. The bluecoats have fed the Sioux chief. His hunger is gone," responded the Indian. "Will you return to your people now?" asked the guide. "As fast as the crow flies to his nest. His braves mourn him as dead and gone to the happy hunting grounds, but the scalp of the Sioux chief will never hang in the smoke of a Tamlicky lodge," declared the savage, standing tall and proud. Then he turned his attention to the train of emigrant wagons and asked, "Does my white brother hunt with the white wigwams that go to the setting sun?" pointing to the group of travellers. "Yes, I am their guide," Dave confirmed. "And the tall chief who wears the hide of the coyote," indicating Albert, who was speaking with the corporal, "does he hunt with my brother?" "Yes, we are the chiefs of the train," replied Dave, puzzled by the Indian's interest. "What is my tall white brother called?" asked the redskin, referring to Albert. "Albert Colt," responded Dave. "Crow killer?" questioned the savage, his uneasiness showing in his demeanour. Dave responded with surprise, wondering how his companion could recognize the Yankton Sioux so well. "Have you heard of the Crow killer, then?" he asked. "The deeds of a great warrior on the warpath spread far and wide, like the white clouds drifting over the prairie." "The Crow killer is a renowned chief," answered the Indian, a peculiar glint in his dark eyes as he spoke of the famed Indian fighter. "When does my brother depart?" asked Dave. "When the moon comes, the Sioux chief rides like the wind for the big river, Missouri. His warriors wait for him, and the singing bird that sings for the chief does not sing when the wigwam is empty and the nest is cold," replied the Indian, his gaze returning to the crowd with the same stoic expression. Having gathered all the information he could, Dave rejoined Albert and the corporal. "Well, who and what is he?" inquired Albert. "He claims to be a Yankton Sioux separated from his tribe in a battle with the Tamlickys on the Powder River. He came here seeking food and drink," answered Dave. "A Yankton Sioux, huh?" mused Albert to himself. "Well, I don't rightly know," pondered the Crow killer thoughtfully. "But if I were to meet that Injun 150 miles west from here, I'd say he was a Crow and bet my life on it." "A Crow?" exclaimed Dave in surprise. "That's right, partner, though I noticed he's stripped the decorations off his moccasins and leggings so as to make them plain and hide his tribe. Now, if he were a Sioux, why does he come sneaking here in disguise? That's what I want to know." Just then, a horseman interrupted the Crow killer by galloping into the village from the upper path leading up the bank of the Yellowstone. The horse was covered with sweat, indicating it had ridden hard. The rider, a strong-looking man but pale as a ghost, pulled up in the centre of the village square, enclosed by the fort, the trading houses and the wagon train, before tumbling exhaustedly off his horse. A crowd gathered around him. "What's wrong?" "What is it, stranger?" were the questions fired at him by the onlookers. "The devil's loose," gasped the stranger. "The Indians are on the warpath again on the Yellowstone Trail, as numerous as grasshoppers in summer." "Which Indians?" shouted half a dozen people excitedly. "The Crows," replied the stranger, who then proceeded to tell his tale. He had left Montana with a party made up of 2 wagons loaded with furs and 10 men. They hadn't seen any signs of Indians until after crossing Great Falls and going across to the Yellowstone River. Then they came upon an Indian trail, which one of the trappers proclaimed was that of a war party and around 3 days old. However, as the trail ran straight southward towards them, they didn't suspect any danger. But on the first night of being by the Yellowstone River, they were ambushed by a large group of Crow Indians. The trappers fought valiantly, but they were beaten and had to abandon their wagons and flee for their lives. He didn't know how many of his comrades had escaped, but he, riding a very swift horse, had managed to sneak past the ring of savage warriors and escape due to his horse's speed. In order to get away from the Indians, he was forced to leave the lower trail and go northward instead, and had made it to the fort after 5 days of travelling, whereas he could have arrived in 4 had he come straight up by the bank of the Yellowstone. Dave and Albert listened intently to the story. "Stranger, did you say those red devils were crows?" The trapper nodded in reply to Albert's question. He knew which chief was at the head of them. "My partner, Patrick Burton, recognized one of the chiefs, and he seemed to be the head one of the party. He said it was the White Vulture," the trapper said. Albert's eyes widened in surprise. "You don't say so!" he exclaimed, emitting a low whistle. "Why, he's the biggest fighting man in all the Crow Nation. They say he's a perfect painter on the war trail. I never saw him yet, but I'd like to." There was a strange tone in the old hunter's voice and a strange glitter in his eyes as he spoke. His fingers clenched tighter around the long barrel of his rifle, and his expression boded danger to the Crow chief. "I didn't see much of him," said the stranger. "I was in pretty considerable hurry to get for the open country, but he's a heap of fight, I should say, for he cleaned us out in about 20 minutes, and we made a tough old fight of it too." The captain in command of the fort watched him attentively. "Do you think any of your friends escaped?" he asked. "Well, I don't exactly know," said the trapper, scratching his head thoughtfully. "I guess my partner, Patrick Burton, would get shet of them if any in the party would, 'cause he had a powerful running hoss, an animal that was just chain lightning on the go. It was a hoss from the south. Patrick gave a couple of $100 for him, and that's a fancy price, you know, but he was awful fast and just as handsome a critter as I ever laid eyes on, and I kind of think that if any of the party got away besides me, it was likely to be Patrick and his white hoss." "A white horse?" asked Dave, a sudden suspicion coming into his mind. "Yes," answered the trapper, "a hoss just as white as milk, except it had a patch or two of black on its flanks, and the prettiest beast you ever saw." Was it possible that the Crow chief had the audacity to enter the fort in disguise right after his attack on the trappers? Dave scanned the surroundings for the Indian, but he had vanished into thin air. The guide calmly deserted the group and headed towards the riverbank. The white horse and the Indian had both disappeared. Dave spotted the stranger, who resembled him, mounted on the white stallion and speeding away in the distance on the path leading up the river. "Curse you, redskin," he grumbled. "You've been up to no good. I'll encounter you some day and I'll shoot you, even though you resemble me enough to be my brother." The young man rejoined the small assembly of people near the trapper, who were fervently discussing the details of the recent attack. Dave privately informed Albert of his suspicions. Albert contemplated his suspicions solemnly. "I surmised that the Injun was a crow," he remarked. "In some way or the other I can typically tell 'em, but even though I despise the entire tribe and never hesitated to shoot a crow anywhere within rifle range, I would very much dislike the idea of shooting this man, for he looks so much like you." "So you believe that I'm right in my suspicions?" inquired Dave. "Absolutely, you're spot on," Albert confirmed. "That Injun was the White Vulture, the most prominent warrior in the entire Crow Nation, despite his being a very young brave." "He can't be older than I am," said Dave. "No, I reckon he isn't. I first heard of him about 3 years ago when I was up trading in the Blackfoot territory. A group of Blackfeet invaded the Crow area, and initially they chased the Crows right out of their boots. They captured this White Vulture, bound him to a tree to tease him a bit, but before they lit the fire beneath him, They entertained themselves by attempting to hit his head with hatchets and scalp knives in their demon-like manner. Well, they hadn't tied him very tightly, and a hatchet thrown carelessly sliced one of the thongs that restrained him. In an instant, he broke the rest of the bonds, picked up one of the hatchets, and slashed right and left, slaughtering 5 of the Blackfeet braves swiftly. He then made a dash for his life and managed to escape, even though the whole group chased him. After he returned to his tribe, he assembled some warriors and trailed the retreating Blackfeet, murdering men here and there until at last their retreat turned into a stampede, and they raced north as if the devil was chasing them. Well, I was in the Blackfeet zone when the group returned, and I heard everything about it. The following year the White Vulture reciprocated the Blackfeet's visit and raided their entire region with a small team, hardly losing 1 man. From that day onwards his reputation as a great warrior continued to grow. The Crow Indians regard him with awe and think he's a great medicine man. They don't believe there's a bullet capable of killing him. In fact, today he's the supreme chief and the most robust warrior in the entire Crow nation. I'm scared that if he ever comes in range of my rifle again, I'll prove to the Crow tribe that I have a bullet in my pocket that will finish him, Dave said, with a determined look, tapping his rifle's butt. The Crow killer said solemnly, "Do you know, Dave, I don't want to meet the White Vulture." Dave was astonished. "Why not?" "Because I would have to kill him, and I don't want to do that. It's strange that we've never crossed paths until now. The last time he assaulted a wagon train between here and Fort Benton, I was supposed to be the guide with that group. But at the very last minute, I had an overwhelming feeling saying, 'Don't go.' A voice whispering 'Don't go' right into my ear. I refused to go and got somebody else to fill in for me. At that moment, I thought I was acting like a fool. However, that wagon suffered an attack, and all the stock was taken away by the Crows, led by the White Vulture." "Well, that's odd," said Dave. "It's more than odd," replied the old guide in a serious tone. "I have a feeling that we might not meet in battle, and then again I feel like one of us will die if we ever cross paths." "The White Vulture will be the one to go down. I would bet my life on it," declared Dave. "I don't know, Dave. I don't know. He's a good fighter, quick as a cat and fierce as a panther. People say that he's the best sprinter in his tribe and a sharpshooter with his rifle. In a fair fight, I feel like he has the upper hand against me. The Indian owes me a debt of honor because I killed his father," Albert revealed. "You did?" Dave was surprised. "Yes." At this point they had arrived at the open grassland, just past the wagons. They paused there. "Sit down," Albert instructed, "and I'll tell you all about it." The 2 guides sat on the ground. Albert took a moment to consider the past before speaking. "Of course. You've heard, Dave, that these crows killed my father out here on the Yellowstone Trail, and he died in my arms?"